Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Nicholas DeMoncho. I'm the director of the Berkeley Center for New Media. I'm standing in for my dear colleague Shannon Jackson tonight. Shannon is the Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts and Design and the convener of the larger Arts and Design Monday Night series, of which our BCNM ATC series is an essential and very happily a part of that larger vision for what it means to have lectures here on Monday night at the BAM PFA. This is the part of the lecture introduction usually where I say, please come to our lecture next week. But as you may or may not know, next week as our final ATC lecture and final A+D Monday night lecture, we are hosting the amazing and indomitable Angela Davis in a 2018 Regents lecture, and the lecture is sold out. We've gone to a ticketing system for our high audience draws, and but I do want to say, while the Angela Davis lecture is sold out in this room, I wanted to mention two places you can go to on campus to hear and see that lecture live, and most essentially be wired in for the Q&A and discussion, which is going to be a large part of that lecture, of that event, and can contribute to it. These locations are also posted on the A+D Monday Night webpage and at bcnm.berkeley.edu. The first location for community members is Northgate Hall. That's the journalism school. Doors open there at 6:30 p.m. And the second current live streaming location for community members is the Multicultural Center in the Student Union MLK building. So both of those places are open to you for next Monday night's event. This event will be live cast but not recorded per Professor Davis's request. So your only chance is to see it at one of the live streaming locations in person, or we will be streaming it also live on our website, bcnm.berkeley.edu. But that's not nearly as fun as seeing it in a room full of excited people. So with that, I give over to my dear and incredibly valued colleague, Anne Walsh from Art Practice, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Hi, I'm Anne Walsh. I am a professor in art practice, and I want to just start off by saying that we're especially grateful to Ian for coming, for spending the evening here with us tonight, for spending the day with graduate students and colleagues. You would think that you were interviewing for a job, given the hours that you're devoting to us. So really thank you so much. It's been kind of a dream of mine to have Ian here for quite a number of years. And given his super loaded travel schedule, we feel especially fortunate. I had the good luck of meeting Ian when I was a new assistant professor here, and he took a video class with me. 12 years later, I am still showing his work, the work that Ian made then. It was deft, uncanny, and funny in the unsettling ways that his current work is. Already, for example, I think Ian was asking, what is sentience? Who and what has it? And suggesting, as so much of his work does now, that intelligence is not just in your head. It's distributed between you and all the objects and other people that are around you. I'm quoting you, actually. Okay, pause from the script to say something that I thought about while I was driving here, which is that I have often felt a little ashamed that I never played video games. Like it showed how much of a nerd I am that I didn't play video games, didn't care about them, wasn't drawn to them, and I've tried to figure out why, because I love serial television, I love other forms of narrative, and I think actually getting to know Ian's work has helped me understand a little better why it wasn't until I started looking at what he makes that I understood better what was not attractive to me, and that was the kind of narrow storytelling of of the video game, and for me, the openness and kind of the weirdness, the good weirdness, not the bad weirdness, of his simulations that feel really open and feel permitted to be boring. You know, there's permission for nothing to happen, and for me, that's also a huge relief as a viewer, to be able to observe kind of nothing closely. So I'm grateful to you for that too. What Ian makes now is better described by him than me, so I'm going to leave that to him. But he likely won't say much about the institutional reach of his work. He's too modest for that, so I'll do that. It's my job. Because it's remarkable. In just the last 4 years, he's created solo exhibitions at the Serpentine Gallery in London, one of which is up right now, MoMA PS1 in New York, the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, the Migros Museum in Zurich, Pilar Corias Gallery in London, the Triennial of Milano, and his work has been included in group exhibitions at the Louisiana Museum in Copenhagen, the Yokohama Triennial, the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in DC, the Whitney in New York, the Taipei Biennial, the 12th Biennale de Lyon in France, and the Sculpture Center. And that's just an excerpt. He holds an MFA from Columbia, and a dual BA in Cog Sci and art practice from here. So we are really, really proud to have you as an alumnus, and please welcome Ian Cheng.
Thank you, Anne. It's really trippy being back here. I haven't been here on campus for 12 years, and I should just say now that I graduated in 2006, and I'm profoundly grateful to Anne Walsh and Catherine Sherwood and Greg Niemeyer. You know, during college, you're just filled with all these conflicting emotions, and life seems both dull and chaotic and shocking at the same time. And you know, you always try to look for little sparks in life, and they definitely sparked something in me. They were sparks for me at that moment, and for that I'm really profoundly grateful. And everything that you see here, I'm 200% the beneficiary of what they sparked in me. So I'm really happy to be here. I didn't have anything formally planned. I just brought my computer, and I thought I'd just show you some files. It's kind of open mic night for me. So, but I thought maybe a kind of illuminating thing to do would be to kind of walk you through how I make a project. And as I make a project, I store a lot of things on my computer during the process of it. I thought maybe I could just go through my two most recent projects and give you a kind of peek under the hood. I want to say briefly that after I graduated Berkeley as an undergrad in 2006, I worked at Industrial Land Magic for about a year and a half. And then, you know, I met so many amazing, super talented, literally genius people there. But after a year at Industrial Land Magic, where they were doing movies like Transformers and Pirates of the Caribbean, and doing all kinds of innovative motion capture research and simulation research, I found I was meeting too many people who were there since Return of the Jedi, who still wanted to make their feature film or wanted to make a sculpture, and that the creative burden of being at such a creative place took something out of them. And I made a very, I think, seemingly irrational decision at the time. It seems rational now, that I really wanted to find a way to choose my own problems. And so I moved to New York. I went to Columbia for grad school. And for those of you who are in grad school here, I can tell you now that I didn't do anything in grad school. I was totally lost. I checked my email for 2 years. I didn't make anything. And there were people who were making prolific amounts of work. So much work that it filled the hallways. I couldn't get into my own studio. And my studio at Columbia had black mold in it, so I was kind of getting drowsy all the time. And it was only afterwards where I encountered a second set of mentors. I started working for two artists, one called Paul Chan, another called Pierre Weig, who both, besides me really loving their work, I really learned what it felt like to like live and be an artist, like because I was around them so often, and I really understood like their metabolism. It sounds weird, but like I understood like when they ate, like when they exercised, how they needed the time in the morning to be away from people. That was a really fertile time to make creative decisions. And I really came to admire how they structured their time and their day, and that this became a real cornerstone and model for me for figuring out how it is I would want to make work myself. And so around 2011, I started making my own work with more frequency. They wanted their own morning, so then that means I had a free morning, which was the perfect time to be creative. And around, just to speed it up, in 2013, I started making what I call simulations. And I think of a simulation as a kind of video game that plays itself. I was sitting in Whole Foods on Houston Street, New York, and I had been making these animations, and I was like really annoyed and hateful of myself because in animation you have to perfect every single second. I mean, you feel this compulsion where, 24 frames a second, each second really matters, and you could just articulate the movement of a hand or an eye blink forever. And I really wanted to escape my own kind of perfectionism. And I thought, if I can make a video game engine just animate things for me, then I could still be a control freak, but I could be a control freak from like all the way out here and not here. And this started what I call simulations. I'm gonna not show you the early ones, but I'll start with the one that I made just last year. And it really starts with a lot of drawing. A simulation, it's a video game that plays itself. There's a huge technical component to it. We can get into the weeds of that if you guys are interested. But where it really starts is something that's really easy. Programming is really, it's become easier for me, but it's really hard. And I always feel that I want to start with like the easiest possible thing. What's the easiest, most facile thing I can do that's really expressive, that I can just get ideas out, that I can start to plan a world. And so it starts with drawing, and so I'm going to show you just a few drawings. I'm going to show you this more recent work called Emissary Sunsets the Self, and it started really with this dumb little drawing here. I mean, it's like this stupid. Art is really stupid sometimes. It started with this stupid drawing, and I don't even know what this is. Like these people in a bubble, and then they're meeting this other thing, which is like a kind of superorganism composed of other smaller parts. So it's like a group with like a kind of orgiastic group or something, and the two combined would be the meeting of two groups, the meeting of two superorganisms. One was a collection of like a mob, and one was a kind of macro superorganism. And I thought that they should be in a landscape together, and that I would simulate how they negotiate each other's kind of presence. And I just want to show you some drawings because this is where it really begins. I just keep going. And I do this for maybe, I don't know, I worked on these just for like a month and a half. In the meantime, I had started working with a producer, which is a really strange thing. Like, you think of an artist being really solo, working on your own. And for those of you who are artists here, you know that being by yourself is like horrible. I mean, it's great for me because I'm introverted, but it's horrible in the sense that like when the project gets really tough, like you start to doubt every aspect of what you're doing. You really get lost in the weeds. And so I hired a producer, and I didn't know what a producer was. I just know that what she became, her name's Veronica. She used to be a video game producer. She just kind of became kind of like my mom or like a gym coach. And it's really important for me to have that voice telling me what it is that was important about this project in the first place. Not even what's important, like what the original feeling of the project was. She'll point me back to like a dumb drawing, like this stupid drawing, and she's the one that reminds me that that drawing was somehow still important, even when I can't see it. And so, before her, I would just kind of talk to myself, and now she could just talk to me. And having her really like guided the process through going from these drawings to starting to think about a really basic narrative, and then more broadly thinking about the idea that I have all these like thoughts and ideas about like characters and a landscape, but all of that can mean nothing if it's not contained in something. And so she really helped me hone the idea that I needed a container. And this sounds so stupid and basic, but the container of a simulation was really important to come across. Like the idea of a simulation being a video game that plays itself really allowed me to have a form to stick everything in and to make sure it accumulates into something. It's sort of like, yeah, it's sort of just having a way to name what it is that you do, and have the energy kind of pool into one place. And so as we're kind of working through these ideas and these drawings, the development of these characters really came from a previous insecurity, which was that the simulations when I first started it without Veronica were these kind of chaotic systems. Again, I keep saying they're a video game that plays themselves. So in my initial simulations, were kind of a group of these kind of objects I was interested in, started to put them together, and wanted to see what properties would emerge when you put unlike things together and start to simulate their physics, for example. But over time, they started to feel really meaningless. And around 2015, I hit this point with Veronica where I felt that as interesting and fun as it was to make these early simulations, they felt inherently kind of meaningless. And I was wondering, like, well, that's not a problem, but what's the opposite of meaninglessness? It's something that's meaningful. And how do we really easily get meaning in life? Well, it's definitely, for me at least, it's through stories. Stories are like just bread and butter. Like, we're creatures of narrative. Stories are the easiest way to convey meaning. But at the same time, I was trying to make a simulation that I didn't have to control everything. I didn't want to control the meaning. I didn't want to make a moral at the end of the story. I didn't want the story to have a fixed ending. And so I really, so I started to think, okay, if I make a simulation that start to include things like these characters who have a set of kind of narrative goals, then I can begin to put them in productive conflict with the larger simulation. I'll show you some in a sec. But just to say that these more recent simulations were really a way to combine something that is narrative, like these characters, they look like characters, they have a certain kind of backstory, they have a certain sort of bias or prejudice again, about things they like and dislike, and to put them in a landscape full of other characters who have very divergent interests, I could start to get maybe a engine or a space that could generate multiple narratives, and it could be both meaningful and meaningless at the same time. It's a little abstract, so I'm going to show you some stuff in a sec. So the next step after kind of just drawing stuff and trying to work out a very basic narrative, here's me trying to work out a narrative. Yeah, I start to develop more of these kind of characters. So this character, it's called an Umin. I just kind of made this up. But the idea being that I really want to create a kind of, again, this kind of group of characters who would mob together. And I had this idea that they'd be like these kind of meerkat-like characters who, when they're faced with a threat in the environment, they would kind of pool together and they would, in a way, be very prejudiced towards radical changes in their environment. And I started to develop ways to procedurally morph, almost like a mascot character. So there's like the main mascot, like, you know, again, I want to save time and energy and work. So I make one character, like the top left corner. And then I tried to create procedural or programmatic ways to morph the body and the physiology of the character to get everything from, you know, from like this buff guy to this teenager to like these children, a kind of a whole kind of community of them. And then there's one character, this character here, who's really in love with the other stuff, the other group, which is this kind of mutated plant. And this character is almost like the tree hugger character of this group of characters. These characters are really scared of these like mutating plants, and this one character is like super in love with it. And again, it's just going back to this idea of narrative, which is I read this very beautiful thing, which is like, a narrative is like a routine that's been interrupted. And in every instance, I try to find a routine that gets interrupted. That's like the source of just really basic interestingness. And so I felt that I really needed the divergent perspective of one of these characters who's kind of like gone to the other side. This is the Power Ranger shot. I don't know. It came out of the simulation, so just these things happen. I just want to speak really briefly about some of the technical stuff before I actually show you the simulation. Then I worked with my technical director and myself to really devise the underlying architecture of the other group, which are, I'll show you in a second, these kind of worm-like structures that grow in really kind of strange and radical ways, and over time can begin to have a kind of ambulation, and over time can begin to kind of possess or take control of these Uman characters. And so I worked with my technical director to really plan that out on a technical level. I'll skip the AI stuff for now and come back to that. This is sort of planning out the AI, which is just a mess. This allows me, again, I'm talking about this idea of a container. This allows me to get into my own interests from, like, for example, in cognitive science, like what it is that defines like a character's personality. And of course, we're always modeling or making simplifications about how an AI works or how a character should be modeled. But you gotta start somewhere, and it's in trying to make it that I actually learned a lot about how I think me myself works, how people work. And this is a real pleasure to make. And what I want to say about the AI really briefly is that the AI in this work contains actually 3 AIs within one character. Oh, okay, well, might as well start with this. So the AI has 3 characters, and the AI being each of the Uman within its head has 3 mini brains. And I modeled this after the idea of my own ignorance, which is that I couldn't think of a way to actually make an AI that was like better than Google, obviously. And I couldn't think of a way to make an AI that encompassed the diversity of human behavior or even animal behavior. So then I thought, what if we just divide the brain in the way that maybe the brain is itself divided between different evolutionary layers? So there's, in the AI I devised, there's a threat layer. There's a threat brain. There's a brain that really deals with threats and deals with fight and flight. And this brain is not always used, but it's the one that's activated when they encounter something threatening in the environment. It's very rare, but it comes from things like video games, like shooting games and these kind of more violent video games. But then for me, the more beautiful layer is the second layer, which I call the limbic layer. And this is very much this is a photo. I'm trying to find an image of it. The limbic layer is very much based on The Sims. In The Sims, they devise a very beautiful AI, because in The Sims, there's really no violence. It's a bunch of, if you're familiar with this game, it's kind of like a little dollhouse, but you're attending to the kind of limbic needs of your sim. Like, is your sim in love? Is your sim hungry, sleepy? All these kind of burning desires that grow more and more urgent as time goes on, to the point where hunger isn't threatening, but it becomes threatening when you get hangry, right? And so when you get hangry, then the limbic system becomes this really potent layer in the brain that overtakes everything else. So once my Uman are not threatened, and then they're like not hungry, they're well slept, then finally a third layer of the brain gets activated, which I call the narrative layer. And in this narrative layer, it starts to be able to plan maybe 1 or 2 steps ahead and 1 or 2 steps backwards about what it's doing. And this gets threatened and interrupted many, many times, more so than anything else. But I think this is, for me, it felt really truthful to how life feels. I just want to show you some in progress. So this is, again, just kind of designing. So the other thing, I call them the worm leaves. They're composed of a small vocabulary of parts, which then can be configured into quite a wide variety procedurally of other like forms, shapes, and even kind of sculptures. This is kind of the part where making art starts to become fun. And I have to say, like, still haven't shown you the work yet, but this really, all this imagery, this occurs in the last like 5% of the project. Like 95% of making these simulations is just a pain and struggle, and it's just really painful. And Veronica has to just coach me through this like a baby. But what it comes out of it is sort of like the, I call it like the Alice Waters like method to making art, which is like I've built and I had built all the best ingredients, and it's just in that 5% where I finally get to play around. I get to kind of cook with it. And here we see this is sort of the product of that kind of cooking. And then this is the moment where the simulation starts to come alive, and I get to see some of the behaviors that emerge. Here I just like populated it with all these women, just kind of, there was no threats, so they were just sort of relaxing. Kind of see all different sort of behaviors that emerge out of this. This one's the funniest one. Where is it? Yeah, like, what's this guy doing? What's he doing? They emote too, so it's clearly really happy about something. Just show you the actual simulation now. Oh, I'll just show you some more making ofs. So with the worm leaves, like this kind of modular plant thing, we devised a new physics system for it. It's based on the idea of a ball spring. And we really tried to make something that felt... That's not, that was my technical director's idea of a joke. We really tried to make something that felt really animated and tactile, because so often in computer graphics you feel kind of rigidity to the 3D models, and we wanted an underlying physics system that really had a kind of sense of life to it. A ball spring model in physics is obviously very common, but to use it for characters is very uncommon, and so we took that approach in order to give this kind of uncanny sense of life that was different from the Umin, which were more kind of avatar-like characters. This was the test of Umin before they were Umin. They're just people, so we're just trying to test how they touch. Again, like during the process of making these things, you learn a lot about what you've seen a lot of and what you have, and often in video games, you rarely, at least I rarely see two characters touch. Often in a video game, you see a character like shoot each other or have some intermediate object that gets passed between them, but rarely do they like hold hands or grapple with each other. And I really wanted that tactile quality. I think there's something more, excuse me, emotive and powerful about that. We started working on an underlying again, out of laziness, we created like a monstrous system that took way more time, but it allowed for these kind of procedural behaviors of movement and animation that obviously any like self-respecting animator would never do. But for me, it's beautiful. It's surprising. It's beautiful because it's precisely because it's surprising. So this was a kind of active ragdoll physics simulation of the body. So the body is interpolating between a handful of motion capture animations and the fact that its body is entirely physics-based, and that when the muscles are like active, it's adhering more to the animations, and when it's more inactive, it's adhering more to the physics and gravity of the simulation. And then everything in between, right? The limbs in between, maybe just the head, maybe the torso, maybe we really fuck with this guy and just make a dead leg, and it could really, yet he still tries to walk. I don't know what this is. Yeah, it's pretty slapstick. what's going on here? Oh, it's just learning to run. Learning to pick something up. Ooh. Again, touching something, like somehow this felt important in making you feel a kind of physicality. Yes, this felt important at the time. Come on. Oh, maybe this was, let's see, IK test 2. This is when success happens, probably. No. Come on, friend. Oh yeah, things like the mass of what it's picking up matter, so. Okay, this is just okay. Ooh, so I don't know why it's jumping here, but okay. So now when this is like when you start to play, so we have our Umin, we have the, the design of it, we have the worm leaves. Now we can kind of just put them. I don't know. We just kind of put them in a room together and see what happens. This for me was a really magical moment. It made me feel the reality of the project for the first time. Where's this go? Oh, touch. Some weird perspective idea that Veronica made me stop. It's like, you're wasting time and money. Torture. Okay, here, now, okay, oh, yeah, this was a good moment. So again, like here, what you see is like this attachment of the head to this worm leaf, but the woman's trying to move. The worm leaf is trying to ambulate in a different direction. And as a result, you get this sort of beautiful emergent contortion and this kind of choreography that no one really designed. Okay, then we went into machine learning for a little bit. Oh, God. So we tried to get the worm leaf to learn how to walk on its own through a kind of genetic algorithm. And just to explain really briefly, it's sort of like training a dog. It's like giving this kind of underlying set of this ball spring physics creature, spidery creature, a goal, a really basic one. In this case, it was just trying to get to beyond these boxes. And running this simulation over and over again, and each time, if it gets closer, it gets rewarded. And in being rewarded, it knows to reinforce these underlying, very basic neural network inside of it to know to do that more. And if it doesn't make it through, like this other guy next to the orange one, never made it through the gates, it gets kind of demoted. So there's a little bit of that. That was hell. You see more of the results of that here. So kind of overall reward for being able to actively move, to effectively move, not get stuck on things. Okay, I'm just going to show you the thing. Oh, again, testing the physics. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a little bit of this. We can watch a little bit. So I want to emphasize it's pretty boring, and this was one of the qualities of a simulation that is actually a feature, not a bug. I kind of think of these simulations as, when they're exhibited, a person could watch it for 5 seconds, or you could watch it for 5 hours, and depending on your mood, your temperament, and maybe where in the simulation you're watching, it really doesn't expect much of you. There's no beginning, middle, and end. It's an app, it's a program. So if left on, it can kind of just continue forever. The worm leaves will keep mutating, the human will reproduce, they'll have offspring that then reinforce certain prejudices against the worm leaves or not. And there's a day-night cycle, so time passes, and it's a bit inspired by these kind of animal cams you see on the internet, where like the San Diego Zoo might have a webcam on a panda, and it's super unremarkable for 12 hours a day, and then just 1 minute it's like revelatory, where like it decides to hobble over if it's over in a sad cage and like break a bamboo stick and take a drink of water, and it's just super amazing. I really thought about this space of how narrative can be there but not the center of gravity. It's a bit like my wife is really, really, really into the Real Housewives of Orange County. And the beautiful thing about that show is there's definitely narrative. Like, over time, if you've seen enough episodes like me, there's a kind of story to each person's life. Their life story. But it's not the center of gravity of the show. The show is really this, for me at least, it's sort of like The Sims. It's this kind of ambient observation of their behavior. I mean, the producers of the show always talk about trying to create a situation with the Real Housewives where the basic way, like, alcohol is present. And when you put together really strong, fierce personalities in a room together, naturally story happens, drama will happen. And I was really interested in this kind of paradigm of storytelling versus maybe the opposite side of that would be like a feature film where there's a beginning, middle, and end, there's a whole narrative arc, characters learn something. And I really wanted to explore this more Real Housewives kind of this more Real Housewives angle, and that over time that there would be narratives that would emerge. There is the narrative, I didn't speak too much about this, but there's, in all the simulations recently, there's always one character with a set of very clear narrative goals. I almost think of it, it's called the emissary. I think of it as the protagonist who really wants to be like in a movie, but is just stuck in the Real Housewives, and is really, or I think of it maybe as a Shakespearean actor who's like trying to do Shakespeare in the part, has all his lines memorized, but then it's the parts that dogs run through, there's bad weather, there's interruptions all the time, and to put these two things into productive conflict, the story and the simulation, it's sort of a contest to see which one will win in a way. The narrative agent for this one is this sort of, it's a bit abstract, but it's this yellow kind of yolk-like puddle that's possessing these worm leaves, and it has a very clear story to it that's been encoded into its behavior. It's the only character in this entire simulation that has such determinism, but it's constantly being interrupted by these Oomen, by I call it the tree hugger Oomen, the one that's following it. It's like overly in love with it and like protecting it too actively, and all the other Oomen who are extremely prejudiced against its kind of over mutation. I'm kind of speeding through this because I want to move on to this newer project, which I'm more excited about now. So this is Emissaries. So more recently, as you can see in Emissaries, it was a really vast kind of, not vast, but it was a complicated enough ecosystem. It had to do with making the AI of all the different agents. It was a group of agents in order to get the emergent effects of agents. and it was like objects in the environment, plants, flora, fauna. I really wanted to simplify my life in a way after making that work. And I really wanted to focus on one character. And so I thought, again, about this idea of a container. I thought, what if I could just make a creature, and the creature would be the container, it would be the box. And if you have a box called a creature, you can stick in it all kinds of interesting concerns. You can stick in it ideas about metabolism, how the body affects the mind, how the mind affects the body, life cycle, and of course AI. And so I started making this project called Bob. And Bob stands for Bag of Beliefs. And initially it started as an AI project. But the more and more I worked on it, the more I realized that AI really needed a body to articulate what it was, what to even think, or how to even think, or how to even sense. And so Bob became a way to think of a creature as a kind of compositional space. I think I'm friends with quite a few painters, and they always tell me like, oh, you gotta mind the edges. And so if you think about a creature and minding the edges of a creature, for a painter, it's sort of like literally minding the edges. But for a creature, it's like thinking about its life, like how it's born and how it dies. And these became, obviously I'm super interested in life and death, but to have a form or container to hold those thoughts became really useful for redirecting my energy into one thing. That energy was directed toward this thing called Bob. So again, I started with with drawings. I'll show you a few. I had this idea that the creature had to not be a pet, that had to be something like Smog in Lord of the Rings, or do you know this movie Moana from Disney? There's this character Tamatoa. He's like this big, fabulous gay crab who loves shiny things. And the feeling you have when you see either Smog in Lord of the Rings or Tamatoa is that they are kind of like a Real Housewife doing their own thing, and then this fucking hobbit comes in and tries to make a movie of it, like trying to like hijack Smog into its movie and become like the third act climax. But when you encounter Smog, and what's so beautiful about what Tolkien did was that you encounter Smog in repose, in kind of a sleepy mode. Like Smog had no problem just hoarding lots of gold and goblets and just living a life in that mountain. And then the hobbits come along. But what's so beautiful about seeing a creature in both states, the fierce state that we all know dragons can get into, and then the state of just kind of sleepy repose, is that I think you start to see the creature as more than just a kind of villain or a symbol, but also like a creature that, I don't know, you start to respect it. It has its own time, it had its own life, it has many stories to tell. And I really wanted to create a character and a creature, an intern AI, that really had its own life in a way, like literally lived its own life, and then on occasion would be sort of bothered by you or me as a viewer, to actively kind of engage with it and to kind of try to reel it into our own story, but that it had its own life, it had its own adventures, and that you could respect it as something more than just a kind of Tamagotchi or pet. So Bob kind of started as this was one of the very first drawings of Bob, and kind of ended up, I don't know. Art's dumb. I'm telling you, art's really dumb. It starts from random places. But if you trust that feeling, if I trusted that feeling, Veronica told me this was like, I should just trust this drawing. It was sort of this idea of trying to make a creature that physically embodied, I think, in a kind of cartoonish way, how our brains are structured. So on the one hand, you have a sort of very focused and active, kind of vigilant head, almost like in a cartoonish way, like your left brain. And then on the other side, you have this kind of fractalizing set of nodes, almost like a tree or like an anemone, or like a kind of, over time, a kind of a group of, like a mob of creatures that, if you imagine each tip of this as a kind of a member of a group, you kind of get this sort of right brain feeling. And I wanted initially with Bob to have its AI and its memory be physically mapped to its body. So its body was a direct reflection of how it was architected cognitively. And that was the original idea of Bob, and I kind of just ran with it. And I just thought, okay, when Bob is angry, um, but sort of aware and in control and well hydrated and not hangry, like its head would be sort of the dominant force, and it would be more like a dragon. And then when Bob's head was really metabolically like sleepy and maybe malnourished, the other part of its brain, its right brain, would be much more active and kind of be more like a mob and take control. Um, Here's a better drawing. That's not a better drawing. Where's the better drawing? I'm gonna find something like this. So you see kind of different states. Yeah, so you got Mob Bob, right? And then you have this is a really worn out Bob where like no one's in control here. This is a Bob, Bonsai Bob is like a Bob who's really settled into something. He's not very adventurous, he really likes this idea of home. It's almost like a perfect parent or something. And then Starship Bob is like the adventurer, but as we'll see in the actual simulation, often the adventurous Bob loses a lot of body mass. Like it literally can't be as like kind of flowering as Bonsai Bob because it doesn't stay in one place. So its center of gravity, its mass, all has to get pruned in order for it to physically be on the prowl more. Show you a few more. This project gave me a way to think about the life cycle, like so how a thing grows. Often in computer animation, you have a single state of a character. You have it like it's like the hero model of Superman or the hero model of a soldier, but you never get to see that soldier grow up from a baby. And I thought it'd be so beautiful to model the entire life cycle of a creature and to simulate that. And so that gave me the opportunity to think about Bob and compute the simulation on a much larger time scale. I had to think about, again, the edges, how Bob is born and how Bob might grow and all the different mutations Bob's body might take, and then finally how Bob might die. I'll show you. Okay. Let's watch some videos. So I can show you where Bob started, like kind of just again. Oh, so this relates to the previous project. So again, using this ball spring model, which I found so beautiful, and I felt like it was an idea that was kind of malnourished in the last project. It sort of was cluttered with all this other stuff, this overlying narrative in the previous simulation. So really, again, when I focused on one character, and I thought the physics of this was so beautiful that I just really had to go to town with it. It's sort of starting to become something. Oh, so here's like it trying to reach something, so it uses its longest appendage, whichever that might be at any given time. You can see its tapering sort of changes. Oh, I don't. What's this? This is I thought I wanted to give Bob a friend, but then I decided against this. I thought Bob would do well with a water buffalo, and you would respect Bob more if you had a relationship in life with a buffalo and preceded your relationship with it. But that got scrapped for reasons we can talk about later. I mean, I'm not against this instinct. I thought that in like Pixar movies where there's like two characters, there's like Buzz Lightyear and Woody, or there's Nemo, or like there's Nemo's dad and Dory. There's something about narrative, even when it's as open-ended as a simulation, where having two characters immediately you understand a certain dynamic. And it's very potent because each character can represent a kind of perspective rather than an actual person. They can be a perspective that's a little bit different from the other character's perspective, and they both live in the same world, so they encounter the same problems. But because they're either physically different or they're mentally different, they approach the problem from a different angle. I think this is personally the success of Pixar movies, but try to kind of cannibalize that idea. But the buffalo wasn't quite right. Where does this go? This gets really fun. So then I thought, okay, if we were to take the idea that the end tips of Bob could start to have their own agency when the head of Bob was more dormant or asleep, I thought, oh, let's make all the little tips as if they're flocking agents, so that they would flock with each other, and this would of course ripple into the rest of its kind of armature, into the ball spring physics model, and create like pretty strange movements and ambulations. So what's happening here is all the tips are trying to flock together, but they're constrained by the physical connection they have with each other. Normally when you think of flocking, you think of all like a bunch of birds, and each bird is like an independent unit. But here it's kind of flocking against herself. And immediately you start to get kind of personalities. Like here's a sort of, I don't know, you can project a kind of caterpillar or like kind of dragon in control like creature. But then if you flip, such flip somewhere. Yeah, when it flips here, you get something more plant-like. It's such a simple inversion. This is trying to test it actually touch something. Again, just touch is really important, I think, in CGI. Weird shapes, I don't know. Oh, you can see how it grows. Like here's like a growth explosion. It's the face, right? The face is super important because in a way that's our interface to how we relate to something as alien as a made-up creature. And if this one side of Bob, this kind of head or face, was to represent how we as human beings kind of like look upon a creature, we always look upon, we're just really tuned for faces. Bob had to have it's kind of a motive capability. Yeah, I just want to say about this, like on one hand it's really cartoony and amusing and kind of dumb, but I kind of felt that like in the context, when I have a container that contains so many things, then like there's just no shame in doing something like that. I don't know. Okay. Stretching Bob. So Bob's elastic. So what happens when you stretch it? You start to feel sorry for him. I don't even know. I mean, this is how off track you can get a project. Like, oh, I have to model the underlying skeleton of the water buffalo that I'm not going to use and waste time and money on. Okay, so we're kind of getting there. Ooh, okay. Bob trying to eat for the first time. Bob trying to throw something for the first time. Bob trying to throw the water buffalo friend. Bob just being, I don't know, evil. Ooh, this is Bob self-pruning. It's like picking out every eyebrow in inches. Yeah, I really wanted to make a creature whose underlying AI felt really intense, like it had a personality. Like it wasn't when you think of like AI now, conventionally, you think of maybe like Siri or Alexa, who have this kind of neutral, kind of concierge personality. And I really wanted an AI that had a really kind of extreme personality, or that had some really kind of bad characteristics, not bad, but just kind of, yeah, bad characteristics that you could kind of come to love in a way. It's called bag of beliefs, and if it believed in something like self pruning, whatever that means, um, that it could then just sort of be that bad guy for you. Like Smog the dragon is a dragon for you, so you don't have to, like, it embodies certain characteristics that you can just think, oh, it's like Smog, or oh, it's like Bob. It's just chasing its own tail. So I guess I can show you a little bit of Bob. Oh, I want to show you first a little bit how it's. What I haven't shown you yet is how it's physically exhibited. So this was at the Serpentine in London. It's a very beautiful exhibition space in the park. Um, so here's how Bob was initially shown, which is that, again, this, a lot of AI went into this, but to say that it's purely it's like an AI work, or that I now am an AI artist, would be really sad. And I think about layers. I think about like AI being sort of the plumbing, but like I'm not a plumber. I'm like I want to play with the water, and so Bob is very much. I try to extend that metaphor to the installation, so you feel that Bob is a creature when you encounter it physically. I think first impressions matter, and so when you walk into the Serpentine, what you see is something I hope would feel like a kind of like a reptile house or like an animal sanctuary, and that it just takes a little suspension of disbelief to feel that this AI creature, this kind of artificial sentience, has the same status as maybe a real creature would in real life. Um, and the special thing about this exhibition, which I can't show you actually yet here, is that there was a kind of a component in which the viewer could use an iPhone X and actually Skype, in a way, Skype with Bob. And that Skyping with Bob occurred on one of those. Skyping with Bob meant that you would literally possess one of these kind of heads that grew out of the end nodes of Bob, and Bob would perceive you as a human, not as a human being, but as almost like that kid in The Shining whose pinky kind of hears a voice and like that pinky comes alive. So you're fully within Bob's world. You're almost the spirit to Bob's kind of reality. And that this was an essential part of the AI so that Bob could begin to have gain kind of emotional data from you as a viewer. And just to be very brief about the AI, the one aspect of the AI that I'm super proud of that we managed to do, it's not mind-blowing, but I think it's interesting, is that Bob is constantly sampling. I'll just start it, actually. So here's an example of Bob. Boring, right? I wanted to say real quick, you can kind of watch in the background. Bob's AI is composed of those three layers I talked about in Emissaries, the previous work. But in addition to that, what Bob is doing about every 10 to 20 seconds is sampling maybe like 20 to 25 different parameters about its body, its metabolism, it's the time of the day it is currently locally here, how old it is, and during this kind of iPhone interaction, the viewer's face. And each of these data points is pretty meaningless, I would say, individually. But as a little mini collection, it gets saved, and it gets saved as a memory. And that memory gets stored in this humongous, it's called a KD tree. And a KD tree is something that's like really quick to search. And so whenever Bob, as an action, wants to feel something, we thought really deeply, we try to think deeply about what it means to feel something. And I came to the conclusion that feeling something isn't about feeling something in the moment. It's taking in all the similar data points that we have right now and comparing it to the closest memory we have that matches this. Of course, the closest memory I have of Berkeley was like 12 years ago, and things have changed. And I register all those changes. And if maybe I was like an unhappy undergraduate at the time, all the changes I perceive now are I'm a happier person. Things seem to be getting better in Berkeley. But of course, it's super subjective. And your frame of reference of what memory you choose to compare to the current moment completely colors what's better or what's worse. And so Bob is constantly making this comparison. We call it the delta between the current frame of reference and the closest memory that matches that situation. Maybe a similar time of day, maybe a person who's smiling and interacting and it's sunny today. But what this allows is that judgment of whether things are better or worse, is that Bob then associates all the other qualities Bob was doing at the time. Let's say Bob was getting fed at the time, so Bob has to be fed. If it's judging this moment as worse, it might inadvertently associate getting fed as something really negative and therefore have a kind of aversion to food, almost like a traumatic memory of food. And then therefore in the future, be less inclined or attracted to food. And over time, I can't really, here's a little bit of, I mean, it's hard to visualize this stuff, but this is the closest we can kind of see. You can see each of these long lines is like a recording of a moment, and then some of these are the kind of the feeling of it, which is the judgment. So it's about, how do I say it? It's taking these deltas and things are changing in its environment, and then on top of that, the idea is that then Bob has an attitude toward change. So change is inevitable in Bob's environment, but whether that change is good or bad is its attitude. And what it judges as to what to look at for what's good and bad forms a kind of personality over time. It's sort of abstract to say all this, but I think it kind of gets at the heart of feeling things like emotions or personality are really just really super convenient labels for us to talk about something I think is much more horizontal and complex that's happening in our own mind. We really try to model this aspect of cognition, at least in this project. Watching over the Bob. This is me just moving stuff around. So during the exhibition, Bob is manually fed by gallery assistants there. Obviously, that's something that can be automated, but I have a dog, I have a little corgi, and it pisses me off so much. He's really yappy. But when I have to feed him twice a day, and when I feed him, I don't know, you just fall in love with something when you have to feed it, right? And so I felt that, again, to create the sense that this is as a status of sentience, it was important for the gallery attendants who are there day in, day out, watching the boredom of this Bob character, that they feed it. And I think they say they love Bob now. And then there's there's different kinds of food that then can turn off and on different aspects of subparts of the brain, as drugs might do or coffee might do. There's even there's even secret food. Remember this, we're in Berkeley, right? You guys like meat? So we can keep watching this. Thanks for listening, and I'm super happy to answer any questions.
A little bit about ethics and empathy. I think so much of what we're confronted by in a simulated world are things that we don't empathize with, or that we're killing or doing other. And you've thought so beautifully about how to produce a very different kind of feeling and engagement with these creatures, and yet we also therefore empathize with them, and we see their suffering very differently. And so how do you construct for yourself a sense of what's ethical in terms of the suffering of an object that doesn't exist, but with which we're investing a part of our own soul?
Yeah, I mean, my gut feeling is when I'm making this thing is I'm so happy to torture it.
Yeah.
Completely happy. And then knowing and thinking that this is a simulated creature. But then when it comes to the moment where it's in the space, it's physically in front of you, and you feel sorry for it. Like one time at Serpentine, during their first weeks, one Bob completely pruned itself down into a little stub, like a nub. and you felt so sorry for it. And at that phase in its life, it just couldn't grow back to this kind of scale anymore. And I don't know, like I just kind of think that, as with anything, you as a human being, you have to work. I'm reminded of when you're a kid and you just like all your stuffed animals are constantly talking to you, and it feels really real. And I just think in the very near future with artificial intelligence, we're going to have this kind of Shinto-like spirit world where everything's just talking to us again in its own way, and we can't help but feel empathy for our self-driving car.
Great. Other questions? We have a question here.
Could you say a little about the sound in your work?
Yeah, the sound, so Bob's voice, first of all, is really, it's based on this one otter it's based on this otter called Nellie the Talking Otter. It's this famous otter who could talk. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to find a voice that, again, that had a kind of repose, so it had this kind of cuteness, but then had a kind of ferocity. And with Nellie is really, you gotta see it real quick, sorry. Oh, I don't have Wi-Fi here. Air Bears, Cal Visitor. Nellie has this kind of ferocity about it because it's an otter. Otters are really nasty creatures, actually. And then this other sounds are designed. I worked with this really amazing sound designer called Jeremy Yang, and his day job is to design emotive sounds for self-driving cars, and how to make a sound that without English language can tell you like you may cross or something like this. And I hired him precisely to kind of create a sound vocabulary for Bob where you're meant to empathize or you're meant to have an emotional reaction to it, but it doesn't need to speak English in order for you to feel that. It's almost like when you drive really fast by like a couple having an argument, you understand the emotionality of their argument, even if you don't hear the English. And so this was sort of the premise of the sound.
What? You don't say. Really? How come? Really?
So you just get everything.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk more about how you think through the personalities of your characters, and specifically like what practices you use to understand like how Bob wants to exist in the world.
Yeah. I initially thought of these kind of archetypes, and I thought of it's the whole other side of my procrastination. I started making these guides. It's a guide to Bob. Oops, that's not it. This is something else. Just to see. Ooh, this is definitely not. There's other stuff I want to talk about, but sometime. Oh my god, I'm sorry. Where is this flip out? Okay. Sorry. Here we go. I started thinking about how Bob, in regards to personality, is physically expressive of its personality, like its body language. And I also try to think about how Bob is internally at any given moment, what mindset it's in. I love this book called Games People Play. It's by a psychiatrist called Eric Byrne. He says people have all through life a child mindset, an adult mindset, and a parent mindset. And roughly, a child is kind of this sort of playful but irresponsible person inside you, and then the parent is the one who just really doesn't want to spend any energy and just says, "This is the way things are," kind of as a way to, very logically, as a way to conserve energy, but kind of is the inheritor of received mindsets. And then there's the adult mindset, which is the kind of person inside of you who is pretty soberly confronting a new reality or reality you haven't encountered before, and then trying to make a decision about it. Like something as simple as crossing the street, you're not the child or the parent, you're like really focused on the problem at hand. And that these three mindsets, I added a fourth, these three mindsets form for me an underlying model of Bob's like inner life. And then Bob's outer life, in terms of how it's expressed in its body, started to become like those drawings I showed you earlier. I mean, I gave them kind of names like bonsai Bob, starship Bob, Bob, vegetable Bob. But really what that means is sort of it's an orientation toward, it's an expression of its attitude toward its life. So for example, a bonsai Bob is a Bob that's essentially in a way very close to a constant parent mindset. It's a Bob who wants to conserve energy, is like, pretty mature, but would rather like settle down somewhere, literally plant its roots, and kind of become a tree. I'm reminded of there's a really strange sea creature. It's like a mollusk, I think, that goes searching for a place to live. And when it finally finds the perfect rock, it sucks onto the rock. And then in order to sustain itself, it has to literally consume its own brain. And in consuming its brain, it becomes brain dead. But then it's like this happy, blissful bonsai. And then these other archetypes here, which I can get into. But I try to find this underlying model that has enough expressivity in it to model the personality.
Hi, Ian. Thank you so much. That's great. You always were really good at showing reality without pride and without shame, exactly how it is. And now it seems like you're giving these creatures a digital kind of emancipation, and you just take them on their own terms. But what happens when they get out?
How do you mean?
When they get out of the cage, of the frame, of the screen?
Yeah.
I mean, they're kind of like, you talk about zoos a lot, and they're kind of like wild animals. And with wild animals, we all have this condition that they're okay as long as they're in the cage, but when they get out, it's not so funny anymore. So how would we deal with that same emancipation that you're celebrating in a way when they get out? Is it still good, or is there a limit there?
I really believe we just got to try things until they go wrong. And so in the case of something like Bob, the hope is definitely that it's almost like the life cycle of a butterfly. Like this is like the pupa Bob. There will be a caterpillar, then there'll be a cocoon Bob, and then there'll be a butterfly Bob. And for me, the next phase of this, the kind of caterpillar Bob, is maybe a Bob that's on your mobile phone and you have a very literally mobile or direct relationship to it on a day-to-day level. And then I can imagine a Bob who, having trained its life in this kind of simulation or virtual space, becomes a kind of spirit that can possess physical material. For example, like a Bob that is possessing a house. And then I can then imagine maybe a Bob whose personality possesses something like a speedboat or like a little dinghy or like something literally physically mobile. And I don't know, seems dangerous but fun.
I was curious how you reward or punish the Bob or the other beings that you were talking about earlier, like when you talked about training them.
Yeah.
What are rewards or punishments for behavior?
It's not as exciting as the labels sound. It's really just numerical. It's extremely just mathematical. It's in the case of the previous kind of worm creature, it was literally a reward was if it got to the other side of this obstacle and avoided being bumped into, it got like a gold star, like it got a reward, and then thus reinforced whatever there's a kind of neural net, so the kind of weightings of those neurons within it.
So do you have to teach it in advance that a gold star is good?
Yeah, so in the case of that creature, I gave it enough, I taught it in advance of actually displaying the work, enough of how to get from point A to B. But then once I start sharing the work, and this for me is a very beautiful property of simulation, is that we can then, as viewers, sort of experience it continually trying to learn. So those rewards are still in place like when I was playing it just now. It's just that then it allows for it to do some really bad behavior or some really erratic behavior and still learn and make that persistent.
Do you have any desire to have Bob or any of them like respond to any viewer stimulus, or have it like be connected to hardware?
Yeah, I was trying to find an image. I mean, currently it's limited to kind of this Skype interface I was telling you about. But yeah, the hope is that it can just kind of sense a space. It's kind of like that. Where you would possess a part of Bob, and then using the kind of facial recognition stuff built into the iPhone, begin to interpolate or understand or make increasingly good guesses about what your emotional state was, which then, of course, Bob would mirror, and then that would reflect on its closest memory to that, something like that. But the dream is to have it like really sense.
And I guess this Skype response, when you're installing the work, if this piece perhaps learned or created memories through the Serpentine audience, if you reinstall this piece, is it going to retain that, or is it kind of going to regenerate?
100% it retains it. Yeah, that was the dream, to have finally an artwork that really started to be influenced by the viewer, and almost like sending Bob to like 10 different boarding schools. It's like its boarding school started at Serpentine, and it will forever be inflected by British people in a sort of abstract way, but nonetheless, and all that data gets saved. We don't, I mean, it's a little dangerous, but we don't erase any of the memories, so like all of it, just the file just keeps getting really, really big.
Yeah. Thanks.